In the world of true crime, there are thousands of podcasts, each trying to tell the most shocking, heartbreaking, and mysterious stories. Some focus on deep analysis, others on humor, and some on raw, emotional storytelling. But among all of them, one podcast stands out not just because of the cases they cover, but because of the people telling the story. Imagine a husband and wife sitting down to record a podcast. One of them is obsessed with true crime, watching documentaries, reading books, following cases, and diving deep into every detail. The other, he can't stand it. He hates hearing about gruesome crimes, tragic victims, and dark mysteries. And yet, week after week, he sits beside his wife, listening, reacting, and unintentionally becoming one of the most entertaining parts of the show. This is the story of Murder with My Husband, a true crime podcast that turned an unusual dynamic into a full-time career. A show that started as a small passion project and grew into a thriving business with a loyal, engaged audience. A podcast that doesn't just tell stories, it has changed the lives of its creators and, in many ways, its listeners. But how did it all start? How did a married couple turn a simple idea into one of the most talked about true crime podcasts? And what challenges did they face along the way? This is their story. It's a common saying, opposites attract. And in many ways, that's true for Payton and Garrett Moreland. Payton has always been fascinated by true crime. She's the kind of person who, if given the chance, will talk about murder mysteries at a dinner party. She follows cases, researches criminal psychology, and can spend hours discussing unsolved crimes. For her, true crime isn't just entertainment, it's a passion. Garrett, on the other hand, couldn't be more different. He never liked true crime. The idea of hearing about real-life horror stories made him uncomfortable. If Payton was watching a documentary, Garrett was probably in another room, avoiding it entirely. Their relationship worked because of this contrast until one day, during the COVID-19 pandemic, something changed. Like millions of other people, Payton and Garrett found themselves stuck at home, trying to figure out how to spend their time. With nowhere to go and nothing to do, Payton had an idea. "I was always talking about true crime with friends and family," she said. "So I thought, why not start a podcast?" At first, Garrett wasn't interested. He didn't enjoy true crime, so why would he want to spend hours discussing it? But then, he made a suggestion that would change both of their lives. "If you love it so much, why don't you start a podcast? And maybe I'll be your co-host." Payton was shocked. "You hate true crime," she reminded him. "I know," Garrett replied, "but maybe that can be the thing. You love it, and I hate it." That one sentence set everything in motion. Starting a podcast isn't easy, but success came with challenges. Telling true crime stories isn't just about entertainment, it's about responsibility. Each case they covered involved real people, real victims, and real pain. Researching these stories for hours each week took an emotional toll. Payton struggled with the weight of these stories. "When you're diving deep into these cases, it sticks with you," she admitted. "It's hard to separate work from life." Garrett faced his own struggles. Some of these cases, they hit hard. And then there's the pressure to always be entertaining, to keep growing. And then there were the negative comments. No matter how successful they became, there were always critics, people who didn't like their style, who accused them of being insensitive, who left harsh reviews. But through it all, they kept going. Why? Because their community believed in them. What's next for Murder with My Husband? Now, years after their first episode, Payton and Garrett have built something incredible. They've expanded their content, started donating to true crime nonprofits, and are even considering launching their own podcast network. Their goal isn't just to tell stories, it's to make a difference. And at the heart of it all, their dynamic remains the same. One loves true crime, one hates it. Together, they've created something unforgettable. And that's the magic of Murder with My Husband. So, whether you're a die-hard true crime fan or just someone who loves a good story, this is one podcast you don't want to miss.
There's the technical side: microphones, editing software, recording setups. Then there's the creative side: deciding on a format, choosing which cases to cover, figuring out how to stand out in an already crowded true crime space. Payton and Garrett knew one thing: if they were going to do this, they had to commit. "If we're going to start, we need to do at least 1 year," Garrett told Payton. "No breaks, no missed weeks. Let's see where it goes." So they bought some basic microphones, sat down in their living room, and recorded their first episode. Was it perfect? Not even close. Did they have a big audience? Absolutely not. But they kept going. Every week, Payton would research a case in detail, crafting a story that was both informative and engaging. And every week, Garrett would listen for the first time, reacting in real time to the twists, turns, and shocking details. His reactions became an essential part of the show. He wasn't just a co-host, he was the audience's voice. The person who asked the questions listeners were thinking. The one who expressed disbelief, frustration, and even humor at the right moments. It was a formula that worked. But in those early days, success wasn't guaranteed. Building a community, from listeners to family, growing a podcast takes time. In the beginning, Payton and Garrett were talking to a small audience, friends, family, and a handful of true crime fans who had stumbled upon their episodes. But something interesting started happening. Listeners weren't just tuning in for the cases, they were tuning in for the dynamic between Payton and Garrett. They loved Payton's storytelling, but they also loved Garrett's reactions. Fans started sending messages, commenting on episodes, and sharing their thoughts. They felt like part of the conversation. And as the community grew, so did the podcast. By the end of their first year, Murder with My Husband had built a dedicated audience. They weren't the biggest true crime podcast, but they had something just as valuable, a strong, loyal fan base. And that's when things really started to change. After a year of consistent episodes, Payton and Garrett knew they had something special, but they also knew they needed to grow. So they made a decision: they would edit video. They bought cameras, set up a small studio, and started recording full video versions of their episodes. This move brought in a whole new audience, YouTube viewers who preferred watching over listening. At the same time, they launched a subscription model. For $9.99 a month, listeners could get ad-free episodes and 2 bonus episodes per month. It was a risk. Would people actually pay for extra content? The answer was a resounding yes. Subscribers flooded in, excited to support the podcast and get exclusive content. It was a turning point. Within months, Murder with My Husband went from a passion project to a full-time business. But success came with challenges.